Hello, everyone. Welcome to lecture number 2 in theory class. This lecture is entitled Environment, and today we'll be talking about some of the ideas that were brought up in the reading, for example, vernacular architecture as well as critical regionalism. So vernacular architecture is a type of building that is designed based on local needs, availability of construction materials, and also reflects local traditions. It tends to evolve over time to reflect the kind of environmental, cultural, technological, economic, political, and historical context in which it exists. If we take a look here, for example, at here we go, to this map of Europe, we can see that you can almost start to map these kind of vernacular general types. We have mineral structures to the south, where they're using kind of earth and stone as primary vernacular materials for building. And then we have a kind of separation of Western cottages, Eastern cottages, and lodge cabins, which are different kind of wood construction types, and then as well as brick. And then we have nomadic zones also to the far north. And we'll talk about some of these today. And it's a huge topic that can't be covered in kind of one lecture, but we can start to get an idea of what vernacular architecture looks like. And how it kind of is shaped by its environment, biome, and local available materials. So let's take a look at how people live, for example, in the mountains. This is in Norway. Norwegian climatic conditions include, of course, very harsh winters and long winters, high winds, and in coastal areas also salt spray. And so here they incorporate the earth as a form of insulation on the roof. So you can see that they are covered by the kind of grass and moss of the surrounding environment. You can also see here in this particular instance that they are built out of stone. Sometimes they are built out of wood, but in this particular area, it's pretty obvious that there is a lack of trees, and so stone becomes a primary building material as well. This is an image from Cappadocia, Turkey, and they call these earth pillars. And they've been formed by geographic events, and we can see that human civilizations have been carving these houses and also other types of dwellings and churches within these earth pillars for a very, very long time. The traditional Cappadocian houses are just carved right into this stone. Generally, these houses are constructed on the feet of the mountain. Rocks are the only construction material in the region, and they are very soft directly after quarrying. When the quarried rock comes into contact with the air, it hardens and turns into a very strong construction material. Cappadocia specifically is known for its rock-hewn church, monasteries, and underground cities. And as you can see, they also overlook the surrounding area and landscape. Here we can see an example of the mountainous regions of southern China. Very shy to pronounce this, but Qianjiasai in the Xinjiang district. Again, I apologize. You guys can correct me and teach me how to say these words properly. So we can see how the villages and towns here are built up vertically, tier upon tier, climbing up the hillsides and providing a picturesque view. Also using thatch and wood, right? The local materials available to construct their houses. And this is in the Gobi Desert. And you can see this kind of precarious positioning on this mountainside. Again, using the local material. And it's quite an extreme way, right, of building vertically like this. This is Ballybunion Castle in Ireland, and here we can see how the structure utilizes the landscape as well as the available material for fortification purposes. This was built about 500 years ago. But it's kind of, again, the landscape becomes a kind of part of the architecture very directly. Hanging monasteries. This is a monastery located in Greece. And, you know, a monastery is a type of place of isolation and study. And so the placement of this building uses the mountain landscape to achieve this space of study and contemplation. And we'll see some other examples of this moving forward. And I'm also going to just talk about some more specific projects like this amphitheaters of Muyu Ure. And this is in Peru, halfway between Cusco and Machu Picchu. And here we can see an ancient theater that we can't really see anything like this anywhere else in the world. It was built by the Inca tribes of the Maras, and it comprises 4 theaters in the round and 1 in the form of a horseshoe. Of course, calling this a theater is a kind of Western application of you know, ideas. So, you know, how we define this kind of program or space, we actually don't really know how it was used, but it would have accommodated about 60,000 people, the largest of these theaters. And it would have had, you know, incredible acoustics, right? You know, this is the kind of point of this kind of carving out of the amphitheater, is that it creates a really kind of perfect acoustic environment where the sound travels and is easily kind of heard by all people sitting there. So it's quite fascinating. And also, you know, they're using the kind of site of you know, a meteor, right? So it's an existing kind of crater, right, in the landscape that they're utilizing and then terracing or terraforming in order to form this kind of architecture. And here we can see another image. Houses of the Dead. So this is an image from Lanzhou in the Chinese province of Gansu. And in many cases, houses of the dead or places of burial are actually constructed more solidly than houses for the living. And this very kind of beautiful arrangement here reminds me a lot of kind of Isamu Noguchi's contoured playground. It becomes a kind of sculptural rather than architectural way of working with the surface of the land. Here we have Erdek's necropolis, which is a Bronze Age burial site near Xinjiang, Western China. And it's quite an amazing tomb complex. It contains about 330 tombs, about 160 of which have been looted. But it looks, you know, like a sculpture, right? It's this splintery kind of architecture becomes this amazing monument. And so it's much more than a ruin. It has this kind of incredible composition. And of course, also the kind of corrosive action of wind carried sand has also kind of changed or maybe even improved the design over time. Here's another image. The necropolis of Pantalica in southeast Sicily, Italy, is a collection of cemeteries with rock-cut chamber tombs dating from the 7th to the 13th centuries BC, and there are over 5,000 tombs here. And, you know, these are incredibly durable and versatile, Although they were originally, as I said, an acropolis or a burial place, they were converted in the Middle Ages into dwellings, and would even kind of form these multi-storied apartments connected by interior passages. And we can see other examples of this all over Sicily. And it's interesting to see, you know, you're carving directly into the existing stone, and the square, this kind of very man-made, you know, shape, right? Just kind of cut into it. It's quite a beautiful juxtaposition. Architecture by subtraction, which of course the last project was an example of. But here we have the baobab tree. It's a tropical tree, tree of tropical Africa, and sometimes reaches a diameter of up to 30 feet. And its wood, being very soft, is often hollowed out and actually used as dwellings, as you can see here. So people live inside. Occasionally, we can see examples of entire towns being carved out of live rock above the ground. This is in Les Bans-en-Provence, and these are kind of ramparts, castles, and houses which were cut out from this mountain on which they stand. It was a very important place in the Middle Ages, and it's been since abandoned, but for the most part, but there are some people still actually inhabiting, you know, these structures. Again, the cone-like shape is sculpted by nature. It ranges from the size of a tent to that of a minor skyscraper with as many as 16 floors inside. And here we can see the plan of an apartment inhabited by the Simeon the Stylite in the 5th century AD. The lowest floor contained his oratory, and then above that were his living quarters with a fireplace. And he also had furniture inside made of stone. And so in the plans, you can see how we draw this kind of incredibly thick walls, right, of the stone as it's kind of carved out. And sometimes we can see examples of architecture carved into a single rock like this, and an incredibly ornate and elegant kind of entryway into this kind of interior space. This is, sorry, it's a little bit low resolution perhaps, but this is an image of Loess buildings in China, these kind of underground towns and villages. Loess is a type of silt, and it's a material that they use, or that the ground is kind of composed of, which is quite soft and very, very porous, and so it can be easily carved. And so in some places we see roads that have been cut as much as 40 feet deep into the original level by the action of wheels. And so we see this in Honan, Shanxi, and Kansu. About 10 million people are still living in these dwellings hollowed out from the Loess. And here we can see a section, again, this kind of very thick, solid pochette of the ground, and the very, very effective dwellings that are carved out from the ground. These dwellings are very clean, they're free of vermin, they're warm in the winter, they're cool in the summer. And they're not just dwellings, they're also factories, schools, hospitals, hotels, and government offices that are built all underground. And they have light, as you can see, coming from above, and they open up onto a courtyard on the bottom. And it's quite a kind of amazing image to think of approaching this town and not seeing any buildings, but just seeing kind of smoke rising from the ground. Now I want to talk about a civilization from the Neolithic period. Çatalhöyük was composed entirely of kind of domestic buildings with no obvious public buildings. And it was one of the first places in the world where humans lived in very dense settlements. From about 7,500 to 5,700 BCE, it's estimated that about 5,000 to 8,000 people lived in these mud brick houses with roofs, which serve as streets. So as you can see, the entire circulation system of the city is on the roof. So not unlike the kind of Loess structures that we saw previously. What's amazing though is that, you know, there's no kind of space in between, right? They're very, very densely packed together. You don't see any real footpaths. You don't see, again, any streets in between dwellings. And so they're kind of clustered together very, very tightly. And the ceiling openings would, again, serve as the kind of source of ventilation, allowing smoke from the houses, open fires and ovens to escape. And this is a map of Çatalhöyük, and it's the oldest known map and the oldest known landscape painting. It dates back 6,200 to 6,200 BCE. So 8,000 years old. And here we can see this kind of very, very close quarters. The houses would have had kind of plaster interiors characterized by squared off timber ladders or steep stairs, where they would also have kind of cooking area and an oven on the south wall of the room. Here we can see, you know, the plan, and you can start to think about what would have been some of the dangers of living in such close quarters. Of course, fires, right? A fire breaks out in this area and it's kind of going to be relentless. And then also, of course, the obvious space constraints. So here we can see a kind of, illustration of what these dwellings would have looked like. And also as part of, their rural life, the people of Çatalhöyük would actually bury their dead within the village. And they could find human remains often underneath the floors, beneath particularly the stoves, and the platforms within the main rooms and under beds. And so it's kind of an interesting idea to have this burial site within the domestic setting, which is also quite unusual. Here's an interior reconstruction, and again, burying the dead beneath the floor. But it's really fascinating to look at these kind of settlements, or cities, I should say, and wonder how would the culture have been different in this kind of tightly knit community. Surely it changes the way people think about privacy and communal space. It takes on very different meaning. And this is, of course, an example of a kind of adobe structure. And so I'm going to talk a little bit further about that. So adobe is an incredibly, strong and just very reliable building material for certain climates, particularly hot and dry climates. Of course, you're using the kind of mud and thatch around you to either create bricks or kind of build up walls. The reason it's so effective is it actually keeps the house cool during the hot days, and then the heat is kind of given off at night and the heat is kind of absorbed into the house and keeps the dwelling warm at night. And so it's an incredibly effective building materials. And here you can see the sort of wood reinforcements that are sticking out that kind of hold it together. This is an example in Ghana of their very, very beautiful structures. Here is a larger scale adobe mud mosque in Bani, Burkina Faso. And again, just you can see the kind of rough outline of the sun-baked earth bricks, the sand and the earth-based mortar, and then it's coated generally with this kind of plaster, which you see more clearly here, which gives it the smooth kind of sculpted look. And one of the kind of most monumental and fantastic examples of adobe architecture is the mud mosque in Mali, the Great Mosque of Djenné. And it's a very large adobe building that is considered by many architects to be one of the kind of greatest achievements of Sudano-Sahelian architecture. The first mosque on this site built in this way was from the 13th century. And then, you know, this actually needs to be rebuilt often. And so it needs to be recoated with mud. And so it's kind of always being remade and reborn through this kind of maintenance. And it's kind of an amazing thing to think of the building as a living thing. Often when we build buildings, we hope that they will last and, you know, for a long time and live beyond us. But this is actually a building which is truly living with its people and is constantly being kind of maintained and rebuilt in a way. So the choice of site is an interesting question. Why do people choose to live and build where they live? So man's physical freedom has allowed them to kind of choose, right, where they want to live. But it's not just about usefulness, right? You know, other beauty also is a factor. And so, you know, privations and danger aren't necessarily the kind of factors that will stop someone from selecting a site. This is an example of that in Greece, on the island of Thera. And it doesn't really, it kind of defies any kind of practical logic, right? It towers above this small port on the brink of a kind of an ancient volcanic crater. And it's all periodically devastated by earthquakes, and yet it's never kind of abandoned. People want to live here for this kind of incredible landscape. And the architecture itself is very sculptural in quality. Architectural areas. Eyrie is actually like a large nest of a bird of prey, typically like an eagle, which is built very high in a tree or on a cliff. And so we call these type of structures architectural areas. Again, this is the one in Greece that I showed earlier. And we can see, you know, it's been inhabited for the last 800 years. And before, people were able to only get up, and you might ask, how do you get up there? They were actually hoisted up in a basket. And so a kind of prototype for the modern day elevator, but quite an incredible kind of positioning. And living on cliffs is, again, something we can see in many parts of the world. For example, in this monastery of St. George in Jerusalem, again, using the kind of stone of the material of this mountainside and creating this kind of incredible little outcrop on this edge. And so, you know, using that material, it kind of really blends in, right, to the landscape in a way. It's like as if it's a slow transition from natural into artificial and back into natural as it kind of pops in and out of the mountainside. This is an image from Mali, and you know, there's about 250,000 people of these this tribe called the Dogons, and they live along the plateau of the Bandiagara. And here you can see just a string of villages built on rocks on this very high cliff. We see a mixture of flat-roofed adobe structures as well as these kind of thatched roof or straw hats. We don't see any streets here again. We don't see any vehicles. And, you know, it's actually an incredibly effective architecture for this climate. And also, just like Çatalhöyük, starts to really talk about their communal organization and their ideas about community. And here we can see another example of the Dogon. And this is in Burkina Faso. So to go further into these kind of these amazing thatched roofs, which of course is using the available material right around. And here we can see in Cameroon, these amazingly shaped roofs of Cameroon, which form the dwellings. And so using the available material again, this is in Vietnam. And we can see the house has a kind of wood construction, but then is mainly made of thatch, both the roof and the walls, which of course is very suited to the climate and is again utilizing this very available material. And of course the house is lifted off the ground to kind of prevent vermin, but also deal with flooding conditions. Another type of architecture that it's traditionally utilizing a thatched roof is the Japanese house. And specifically here we have a picture of the Japanese farmhouse. And the Japanese house generally has a kind of skeleton structure, modular building components, right? So you're using modular building components means that you're using the same type of module. So you maybe have a piece of wood, right, of a certain length, and that particular component is repeated throughout the building. So you don't have too much variation in the kind of types of components, but it's how you bring these components together, which then becomes the kind of interesting part of the architecture. Japanese houses are characterized by an open plan and sliding walls. And so this has been the kind of vernacular architecture of Japan for centuries. And here we can see an example of the very thick thatch roof of the Japanese house. And tatami rugs dictate the proportions of the dwelling. There's never a permanent function in the Japanese dwelling, at least, you know, traditionally. Now I'm talking about the vernacular type. We see that there's a constant kind of shifting, right, of program throughout the day. And this is, you know, we can relate this to Buddhism and this idea of impermanence, right? That nothing is permanent. And so there's these kind of sliding walls that then begin to open up and close the space. And so it's constantly mutating. We also see through the use of these partitions, and which of course is prevalent in, you know, other types of architecture as well, but not very common in Western architecture, is this, you know, gradient of light which begins to come through. So as these partitions become doubled up, right, it becomes darker. As they're kind of opened and slid apart, more light shines through. And so there's this gradient. It's not just on or off light, light or dark. It's kind of much more complex conditions. And this is the Katsura Imperial Villa in Kyoto. And we can see the traditional thatch roof structure and the post and beam wood construction, and the kind of mutable space inside. And so it becomes this kind of series of layers, and which blurs the distinction between inside and outside, and also, as I said, function to function, private to communal. And here we can see this kind of in-between space that bridges the inside and the outside in this traditional samurai style, samurai house. Aquatic architecture. And so the proximity to water, whether it's a river, a lake, or the sea, has always been of great consideration in the choice of a community. Millions of people live more or less permanently actually on the water. Here we can see houseboats in Shanghai, on the Suzhou Creek near the junction with the Huangpu River. The advantages are really obvious here, right? The waterways never need to kind of be repaired. You know, the drains are working well. You have access and plentiful water, a bath at any hour. But also the water acts as a kind of natural coolant, right? So it's like a natural air conditioning, kind of working very well in the hot season in the summer. This is an image of Ha Long Bay in Vietnam. And we can see, you know, they have these amazing kind of floating villages, which are all kind of interconnected in this kind of organically grown network of houses. And the large rock formations keep this water very calm, and so there aren't major waves or anything like this. And so it's actually a very, very peaceful place to live. And of course, there's plentiful food. You can see some nets set up to catch fish. And so essentially they have their food waiting for them all the time right outside their door. And of course, they can also have little floating gardens and things like this. And we can see examples of this even in contemporary architecture. This is the Mokoko School in Nigeria, designed by Kunle Adeyemi, working with the vernacular architecture to kind of think about new forms of architecture. But we'll talk about this in the kind of critical regional part of this lecture as well. Town structures and how the vernacular shapes those are quite interesting. Here we can see this almost pointillistic pattern of Zanzibar and the kind of communal structures. The good part of the town of Zanzibar has preserved its village character with its detached huts, streets, and these kind of vacant spaces. I don't know if we can call them streets, but they run kind of erratically through this town. And then here we can see the more relaxed geometric urban pattern of Marrakesh, Morocco. And this is a very typical Islamic town with these quadrangular houses organized around interior courtyards. So we don't, again, see any traffic arteries. We don't see any roads per se, but just these very narrow passageways. And of course, the narrow passageways stay in the shade, and so they stay cool. But it's also a type of labyrinth, right? You have to kind of know your way around, or you may get lost or get stuck in a dead end. And here we have an aerial view of Labizanga near the Mali-Niger border. And it's a small river port village in Mali. And just you can see the kind of variation again of these flat versus beehive huts, and the various scales strung together like beads forming these informal enclaves. And pile dwellings. We looked last week a little bit at, stilted houses. And pile dwellings are, of course, a way to deal with water. And here we can see an example of this in the Alps, right? Maybe not the first place that comes to mind in terms of elevated stilted houses. And finally, nomadic architecture. Architecture of people who move around, right? Nomadic means people that don't live in one particular set location, but they move either depending on the seasons or depending on availability of local resources, are constantly kind of in flux. And so the Tuareg people are Berber people who have a traditional nomadic lifestyle, and they are the kind of principal inhabitants of the Sahara Desert. And you can see these really incredible thatch structures, which they're able to set up as they are moving. Here is an ancient Chinese painting, and we can see that the kind of tent and pavilion here, which is actually quite, it has a kind of mixture of, right, austerity, but also luxury. We can see these geometric screens of silk set at right angles, which start to lend this kind of grandeur to this camping site. And these would have been, quite amazing fabrications, very huge in size, and also very beautiful. Here we can see an example of a holiday encampment of the Ajir Plateau in the Middle Atlas. And you can see these incredible large tents made of black goat's wool, and a diagram there of the tent structure. The Sami people living in northern Scandinavia and Russia, living in the tundra biome that I talked about last week. It's a kind of temporary dwelling used by these people. It's similar to the Native American teepee, but it's much less vertical and more stable in high winds. And it enables these indigenous people who live kind of above the tree line plains of northern Scandinavia and the high Arctic of Eurasia to follow their reindeer herds. And it's still used by the Sami today, and even other people for camping purposes. And so here we can see inside. There's a fireplace in the middle used for heating and to keep mosquitoes away. And the smoke escapes through the smoke hole in the top, which is usually left open. And occasionally a rough blanket is wrapped around the smoke hole to make this opening much smaller, but not to the point where it prevents the smoke from escaping. In order to prevent smoke from building up inside of this structure, there is proper air circulation maintained by leaving a small opening between the ground and the cover slightly open. So this allows the smoke to rise through the smoke hole without getting all smoky inside. The Inuits, here we can see building an igloo, right? Using snow, and again, an incredibly effective building material for this climate, very well insulated, and using the material around. And we have modern day versions of this. This climber here is going to enjoy a night in this, or at least a rest in this kind of hanging tent. Now, air conditioning has always been a factor in architectural design, but has been very effective in vernacular architecture, and I think there's a lot to learn from it. You know, to kind of maybe rethink the way we construct our architecture today. These are ancient wind catchers, and these unusual roofs are kind of typical in West Pakistan, where the temperatures are really, really high in the summer months, or like from April to June. So basically how it works here is that these wind catchers channel the wind into the building, and the wind blows from the same direction. And so you can see that they're positioning these wind scopes in the same direction across the town. And so that's permanently fixed. And here you can see another example of this. Here is an example from Nain in Iran, where you also see a type of wind catcher. And so the wind captures these openings at the top of the towers. And the way it works essentially is that the wind is drawn into the house. It's cooled as it goes down into the house, right? And then it's moving through. And so this constant kind of airflow is very, very effective in cooling the space. Here is another example where we can see how hot air can be cooled underground and then pulled up from the basement and then pulled out of the wind tower. And again, there's examples of architecture. This is a project by Renzo Piano that actually utilized these ancient, vernacular systems. And so architects are starting to reconsider how they can incorporate this into contemporary architecture, which brings us to the next topic, critical regionalism. Critical regionalism is an approach to architecture that strives to counter this placelessness, right, and lack of identity of modern architecture. So it's hard for you or anyone to say where this place is, where this photograph is taken. And so it's criticizing this placelessness, this also the international style, right? But also kind of rejects overly formal and ornamental types of architecture. Critical regionalism seeks to provide an architecture that is definitely rooted in modern tradition, but tied also to the geographical context and the cultural context in which it is built. It's not simply regionalism in the sense that it is vernacular architecture, it is designed by architects. But it's a progressive approach that seeks to kind of create a middle ground between global and local languages of architecture. And Kenneth Frampton, the author of the essay Towards a Critical Regionalism, 6 Points for an Architecture of Resistance, which you read this week, is the kind of main theorist behind critical regionalism. And he believes that critical regionalism should adopt modern architecture, but in a critical way for its universal progressive qualities, right? But at the same time, value should be placed on the geographical context of the building. Emphasis should be on topography, climate, light, and on tectonic form rather than on scenography. It should be on the sense of touch rather than the visual sense. And so he's also one of the first to draw on the idea of phenomenology for his argument. Phenomenology being the kind of way that architecture works with our senses. Several architects that work with this. Peter Zumthor is also famous for writing about this, but how it activates our senses. So how it feels, how it looks, how it smells, the kind of sensory qualities of architecture. And so if you're interested in that, you can look up this term, phenomenology. Critical regionalists, again, feel very critical towards modern architecture, more modernist architecture, and as well as postmodern architecture. This is Alvar Aalto's Seinäjoki town hall, and it's influenced both by Finnish vernacular architecture as well as, almost like a humanist Italian Renaissance architecture. And where he drew his Italian Renaissance inspiration was mostly in the courtyard arrangement. The main program of the building is housed within this very, very heavy brick, a solid building, which you can see. And then the courtyard is enclosed by this glass circulation space. Here we can see these grass stairs, but also act almost like an amphitheater. They evoke notions of both kind of ancient Greek architecture, but creating this kind of amphitheater condition, but also working with the natural landscape. Here we can see Mario Botta's John the Baptist Church in Switzerland. And Mario Botta uses the local stone to build this church. And so you can see he's kind of going beyond a kind of very clinical modernist architecture, and is starting to think more about materiality and the experiential qualities of the space. And as I mentioned, Peter Zumthor, this is his Vals thermal baths, where he uses the locally quarried Valser quartzite, this material, which is, the main building material. And so that's kind of locally sourced. But also they were meant to he wanted this baths to feel like it was older than the hotel to which it is attached. He wanted it to feel almost like you're entering a quarry or a cave. It's kind of revealing the form of the various bath kind of spaces, which are half buried into the hillside. And then the interior space shows or really kind of celebrates the quality of this stone, which hosts the natural spring. And yet in its plan, it has quite a modernist kind of layout. And it's also very carefully integrated into the landscape. But you can also see there's a looseness to it, where these kind of little rooms are arranged in the center, and they kind of start to overlap with the other pools in which they are kind of embedded. And of course, framing the landscape, the Swiss Alps in this case, where the nature really becomes a kind of almost a painting, right? Like a material in itself applied within the structure. And here you can see these very nice little slits or breaks in the ceiling to let in light, making the roof feel very light, despite it being, of course, not. Here we can see Soto de Moro's Paula Rego Museum in Portugal. And it's constructed with red clay, but with a very kind of modernist application. Where we see the more, it's a typical mixture here where we have this outer material, giving it a kind of local connection. But then on the inside, we see the interior gallery really embraces this kind of modernist aesthetic. It doesn't carry the same qualities as the exterior. It's linked to this greater tradition of, or I should say longer tradition of these blank white walls and artificial lighting as a kind of blank canvas to host the view of art. And so it's kind of both embracing certain modernist principles and then also rejecting them in specific parts of the building, inside and outside, also as it relates to the street versus as it relates to an interior kind of experience. The Bagsvard Church in the outskirts of Copenhagen, Denmark, was designed in 1968 by Jørn Utzon, completed in 1976. And it's considered a kind of masterpiece of contemporary church architecture. And Kenneth Frampton talks about this, and he considers it a really remarkable example of critical regionalism because of precisely its synthesis between these universal or global qualities and then the very local or regional qualities. And so while on the outside, it takes on a very kind of utilitarian approach, right? Denmark is a highly secularized country today. And so it is inappropriate in this kind of secularized, country to, and also Protestant, we should keep in mind, to kind of have a typical church form for the exterior. But then on the interior, of course, we see this really amazing sculptural shell vault as it kind of creates, again, in Protestantism versus Catholicism, we see an emphasis on personal relationship with God versus kind of the Catholic, bombardment with images and sculpture. And so it's about a space of contemplation, and it, has the qualities of a church without, and bringing in this kind of light, right? The focus on light, but it becomes a kind of meditative space, and so fits more precisely in with the kind of contemporary Denmark. So here we can see Louis Khan's National Assembly building of Bangladesh. And again, it's showing how modern architecture in this case can be kind of transcribed as part of the Bengali vernacular architecture. It's deeply rooted into its context. It could be placed, right? In most modern architecture, we can think of it as it could be anywhere, a kind of glass box, right? But here Khan is using local materials and which were readily available, and then could be implemented in a similar way, which would protect from the climate, but also integrating a modern building into an otherwise kind of non-modern context. And so here we can see this application of material. And so it's obviously a very monumental work of architecture. And the artificial lake that surrounds it is actually acting as a natural insulator, but also cooling system. And it also contributes very interesting spatial and lighting conditions throughout the project. And the entire complex is fabricated from poured in place concrete with this inlaid white marble. As you can see, these kind of strips of marble. And so it's this kind of statement of power, right? But also embraces the kind of local materials. Okay, so that concludes our lecture on the environment, and particularly vernacular architecture and the ideas embedded within critical regionalism. I hope this aids in kind of helping to understand the readings better, and I do look forward to responding to your DQs and seeing what you thought. So thank you very much, and I will see you next week.